What if you're sleeping enough, but still not giving your body the kind of rest it needs to heal? In this episode, you'll learn why rest has many meanings and can include meditation, quiet time, and activities you genuinely enjoy, what happens inside the body during sleep, and why those hours matter so much for repair, and how to tell the difference between restorative rest and too much inactivity, which can actually make fatigue and weakness worse. I will also share the remarkable recovery stories of two completely unique individuals who made rest a center platform of their healing journeys. At the end, I'll help you create a simple recovery rhythm that gives your body more opportunities to restore itself without asking you to spend your life in bed. For much of her life, Dr. Terry Wahls saw sleep as time she could use for something else. She grew up on a farm where she was accustomed to getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning. In college, she continued rising early so she could study or paint before classes and routinely slept only 4 to 6 hours a night. Then came medical school and residency, where the demands became even greater. There were overnight shifts and long hours, followed eventually by the responsibilities of medical practice and raising children. Terry was ambitious, busy, and accustomed to getting things done. She later said she actually thought sleeping less gave her an advantage. Looking back, she sees it very differently. Terry had begun experiencing unexplained neurological symptoms years earlier. She had episodes of severe electrical facial pain, which she noticed were more likely to flare after significant stress or sleep deprivation. Later, she experienced temporary loss of vision in one eye. Eventually, after developing weakness in her left leg and beginning to stumble, testing revealed lesions in her spinal cord and abnormalities in her spinal fluid. In 2000, she was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. Terry sought care from specialists, including physicians at the Cleveland Clinic, and began disease-modifying treatment, but her disease continued to progress. Eventually, she required a tilt-recline wheelchair because the muscles in her torso had become too weak to hold her upright for long. She could walk only short distances with 2 walking sticks. Her fatigue became increasingly severe. She was developing cognitive problems, and she feared she was headed towards becoming bedridden. That was when Terry began digging deeply into the scientific literature. She researched neurodegeneration, mitochondria, nutrition, vitamins and minerals, exercise, electrical stimulation of muscles, and other lifestyle factors that might influence what was happening inside of her body. She eventually developed an intensive program that included a radically redesigned diet, rehabilitation, exercises, supplements, and mindset work. Importantly, she returned to meditation, which she had practiced years earlier but abandoned during the busiest years of her medical training and career. She began taking sleep much more seriously and eventually made 7 to 8 hours a priority instead of treating 4 or 5 hours as an accomplishment. Over time, something remarkable happened. Her fatigue began improving. Within several months, she was able to walk further. Eventually, she could walk through the hospital without her cane. Within a year, she completed an 18-mile bicycle ride with her family. Terry did many things during this period, so we cannot conclude that any one individual part of her program was responsible for the dramatic improvement in her function, rather everything working together. But as she continued studying health and applying what she had learned, she came to believe that sleep and recovery were pieces she had underestimated for much of her life that played a major role in her healing. Years later, when asked what she wished she had understood earlier in her journey with MS, Terry pointed to stress management. She now recognizes the need for an equal measure of challenge and recovery. And I think that is what makes her story so useful for this conversation. Terry did not regain function by doing nothing. She moved, exercised, changed the way she ate, rehabilitated muscles, researched, experimented, meditated, and worked hard to rebuild her health. But she also learned that more effort was not always the answer. The body needs periods when we ask something of it, as well as periods when we ask nothing of it. I think one reason that many of us resist rest is that we associate it with inactivity. So, for instance, we think if I'm resting, then I'm not exercising, preparing healthy meals, researching, working, or getting stronger. In other words, people mistakenly think if I'm resting, I'm not doing anything to heal. But physiologically, that is not true. Recovery is work. The body is constantly repairing proteins, rebuilding tissue, regulating hormones, restoring energy reserves, processing what happened during the day, coordinating immune activity, and maintaining the enormous number of chemical reactions required simply to keep you alive. Some of that work occurs while you're active, but many processes are especially dependent on periods when the demands placed on the body decreases, such as during rest. The most obvious example is sleep. During deep, slow-wave sleep, the brain and endocrine system enter a very different physiological state. One of the largest pulses of growth hormone occurs shortly after sleep begins. Growth hormone influences tissue maintenance, growth, metabolism, and organ function. Dysregulation of growth hormone signaling is associated with various diseases and chronic conditions such as cancer, aging, metabolic disease, fibroses, inflammation, and autoimmunity. Researchers have also been able to see what happens to muscle when sleep is removed. In one small crossover study, 13 healthy adults went through both a normal night's sleep and a full night without any sleep. Researchers then measured how quickly their muscles were building new proteins. The night of total sleep deprivation reduced muscle protein synthesis by 18% and increased cortisol by 21% the following day. To understand the importance of why preserving our muscle matters so much during illness, be sure to listen to my episode 88, which speaks directly into this topic. Now, in terms of cortisol, normally cortisol acts as a powerful anti-inflammatory agent and supports the immune system by stopping the body from overreacting to stress. In this sleep trial, it likely increased so significantly because sleep deprivation challenges both the immune system and increases stress. So don't panic if you have one bad night of sleep, because cortisol rising is actually helpful in this instance. However, when sleep is chronically poor or when stress or high cortisol levels last for a long time, the body stops responding to cortisol normally and develops resistance to it, leading to chronic, low-grade inflammation throughout the body. Sleep also communicates extensively with their immune system. One classic experiment involved 23 healthy men whose natural killer cell activity was measured under normal sleeping conditions, then again after they were kept awake for part of the night, from 3 a.m. to 7 a.m. Now remember, natural killer cells are white blood cells that act as rapid first responders for the immune system. These cells destroy cancer cells and virus-infected cells on contact. Natural killer cells help control inflammation, clear abnormal cells, and orchestrate responses in chronic conditions like autoimmune disorders, metabolic syndrome, and neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's, dementia, Parkinson's, ALS, and MS. After those 4 lost hours of sleep in the experiment, average natural killer cell activity fell to about 72% of the participants' baseline level. After they were allowed a normal night of recovery sleep, it returned to baseline. The immune effects of sleep are complicated, and different kinds of sleep deprivation can produce different short-term changes in immune markers, but taken together, decades of research have made something very clear. Sleep and immune regulation are deeply connected. If you are trying to rebuild muscle, regulate inflammation, support immunity, restore cognitive function, or regain energy, sleep is not time taken away from that work, it is part of the work. But rest is bigger than sleep. Rest is also about replenishment. This idea became important in the healing journey of another remarkable survivor, Sylvie Lessard, whose story we're going to explore more deeply in the next episode. But let's talk about it a little bit today. Sylvie was diagnosed with breast cancer in 2007, and when she later looked back at the life she had been living before her diagnosis, she realized how badly out of balance it had become. She was working very long hours under considerable stress, dealing with financial pressure, and leaving herself very few opportunities for pleasure, rest, or anything that actually replenished her energy. At first, even her efforts to heal became another place where she pushed herself. She became intensely focused on food and incredibly disciplined about following the dietary approaches she had chosen. Eventually, she realized she had become so rigid about doing everything correctly that she was squeezing much of the joy out of her life. So she began deliberately putting some of it back in. Sylvie started making time for things she genuinely enjoyed, listening to uplifting music, reading simply for pleasure, watching funny movies, laughing more, and having inspiring conversations with people she cared about. She also became much more intentional about learning how to relax and let go of some of the constant stress she'd been carrying. We're going to come back to Sylvie in the next episode and look at what happened when one conversation with her sister changed the way she faced her cancer diagnosis, and what science now tells us about the people who help us recover from stress versus the people who continually add to it. But for now, we can use her story to learn the important lesson that sleep is only part of rest. You can sleep 8 hours and then spend the other 16 in a continuous state of demand. You wake up and immediately check your phone. You research or read emails while eating breakfast. You drive to an appointment, navigate traffic, answer questions, make decisions, cook dinner, take care of children or aging parents, clean the house, worry about money, and then lie in bed at night thinking about all of it. Your body may be physically sitting or lying down for parts of that day, but that does not necessarily mean you are resting. Rest can also mean deliberately reducing the amount of stimulation, decision-making, urgency, stress, and demand the brain and body are being asked to manage. This might look like meditation, prayer, 10 quiet minutes with your eyes closed, sitting outside without your phone, listening to music, reading something you enjoy, knitting, drawing, woodworking, gardening, watching birds, taking a bath, or sitting with someone whose presence makes you feel peaceful. Now let's start with discussing meditation and mindfulness. Mindfulness is the simple act of being aware of the present moment, and there is particularly good research around mindfulness practices and fatigue. One small randomized study involved 35 cancer survivors who were experiencing significant fatigue after treatment. Half participated in a 7-week mindfulness-based stress reduction program involving meditation, yoga, and ways of responding differently to stress. The other half were placed on a waiting list. The people in the mindfulness program experienced substantial improvements in how much fatigue interfered with their lives and the severity of the fatigue itself. They also reported greater vitality and energy and improvements in depression and sleep disturbance, and the benefits were still present months later. Now, the significance of fatigue reduction goes far beyond simply feeling less tired. Mindfulness gives the body repeated periods of lower demand. Instead of continually reacting, problem-solving, worrying, and planning, meditation creates time when the nervous system can begin shifting away from sustained stress activation. Other research on mindfulness has also found improvements in stress, anxiety, sleep, and autonomic regulation, all systems that influence the internal environment in which recovery and healing take place. Rest practices such as mindfulness may help reduce some of the physiological load the body is carrying while it is trying to heal. And if your energy is already being consumed by illness, treatment, inflammation, poor sleep, and chronic stress, reducing unnecessary demand gives the body more resources to devote elsewhere. That is why I think of meditation as a genuine form of restorative rest. You're not simply doing nothing. You're giving the body a period in which it has fewer demands to manage. Now, there's another form of rest that I think we overlook even more often, which is doing something simply because we enjoy it. Sylvie, our breast cancer survivor, demonstrated this principle perfectly in her journey. 10 days before she received the news that she had cancer, she had received the keys to her first home. She had just finished moving in and was still painting and getting settled. She was a bit weary since she knew owning a home was a stretch to her budget. She was ready to take up the challenge of taking on contract work on top of her full-time job in order to secure a comfortable life for herself and her kids. Because her work life has remained quite stressful, today she makes it a daily goal to consciously put energy and time into learning to ease those feelings of stress and emotions that do not serve her. That is why, as we discussed earlier, she takes time to do things she thoroughly enjoys. Researchers once looked at this in nearly 1,400 adults, ranging in age from 19 to 89. They measured how frequently people engaged in enjoyable leisure activities and compared that with several psychological and physiological measures. The people who engaged in more enjoyable activities tended to have lower blood pressure and lower total cortisol, along with better perceived physical functioning. They also reported more positive emotion, greater life satisfaction and engagement, and less depression and negative mood. Sometimes rest is the absence of demand. There is a difference between walking because you are forcing yourself to hit a step goal and walking through a garden because you love being there. And there's a difference between sitting on the couch worrying for an hour and sitting on the porch listening to birds for an hour. The body may be equally still in both situations, but clearly the experience is not the same. There is an important other side to this conversation because I don't want you leaving this episode believing that the more time you spend sitting or lying down, the better your body will heal. Too much inactivity creates its own problems surprisingly quickly. In one study, 10 healthy young men underwent just 7 days of strict bed rest. In 1 week, they lost an average of about 3 pounds of lean tissue. The cross-sectional area of their quadriceps decreased, their aerobic capacity and leg strength declined, and their whole body insulin sensitivity dropped by nearly 30%. This is an extreme experimental model, and resting during illness is obviously not the same as being placed on strict bed rest for a week. But it shows us how quickly the human body responds to complete inactivity. Muscles need use, blood sugar regulation requires movement, bones need mechanical load, and the cardiovascular system needs challenge. And this is why one of the most interesting findings in the research on cancer-related fatigue is that exercise itself can reduce fatigue. Now, at first, this all might sound contradictory. I'm telling you to rest if you're exhausted and exercise if you're exhausted, but it's not contradictory at all because the body needs both. Movement provides the stimulus that tells muscle, bone, circulation, and metabolism to maintain or rebuild capacity. Rest provides recovery between those demands. If you only push, eventually you exceed what your body can recover from. If you only rest, eventually the lack of use can reduce the very capacity you're trying to regain. Healing often happens in the rhythm between the two. Ultimately, the goal is to give your body enough recovery that you have more capacity to participate in life and in your healing. So here are several ways to begin. The first is to take your sleep seriously. Start with the most obvious form of recovery. Ask yourself whether you're actually giving yourself enough opportunity to sleep. Most adults need at least 7 hours. Many function best somewhere around 7 to 9, and illness can increase what your body requires rather significantly. If you routinely cut sleep short because there is always one more thing to do, experiment with treating bedtime as part of your healing plan. Be sure to practice good sleep hygiene, dimming lights and avoiding screens for at least an hour before bed, ideally more, avoiding eating within 2 to 3 hours of bedtime, having a consistent bedtime routine and schedule, and make sure that your bed is comfortable enough to allow you good rest. If you are spending plenty of time in bed but are still waking exhausted, that deserves attention too. Poor quality sleep can result from insomnia, pain, medications, sleep apnea, restless leg syndrome, hormonal changes, or other treatable problems. So more time in bed is not the answer if the quality of that time is not there. The question is whether your sleep is actually restoring you. The second thing you can do is build a small period of wakeful rest into your day. Choose 10 or 15 minutes when nothing is required of you. This can be meditation, prayer, quiet breathing, lying down with your eyes closed, or sitting outside without your phone. The point is not to achieve some perfect meditative state. It is simply to stop adding input for a few minutes. And sometimes you need enjoyable rest. Listening to music, reading a book, taking a bath, sitting outside, playing with your dog, painting, knitting, gardening, or something else that asks very little from you and gives something back. The important thing, regardless of what kind of rest you pursue, is to ask yourself afterwards, do I feel more restored than I did before? The answer to that is important and useful information. The next step is to stop waiting until you're completely depleted. Many people move between two extremes. On a better day, they finally have some energy, so they try to catch up on everything. They clean the house, run errands, exercise, prepare food, answer messages, and keep going because it feels so good to finally be productive again. But then they crash. Instead, begin experimenting with recovery before you have emptied the tank. Whatever it is you're doing, build rest in before you feel like you're about to crash from exhaustion. So this week, ask yourself one simple question. Am I giving my body enough opportunity to recover from everything I'm asking it to do? Rest is not time away from healing. It is part of what makes the next step possible. If you would like more support between episodes, I'd love to invite you to join my email newsletter. Each week, I share practical healing tools, reflections from the podcast, and encouragement for your healing journey. You can sign up through my website, therenegadenutritionist.com. Follow Renegade Remission and share this episode with someone who needs permission to make recovery part of their healing work. Stay tuned for our next episode, and as always, go be renegades.